on this evening. Yeah, we got 7:35. Everybody's had a 5-minute grace period. So, welcome to Wright-Locke Farm and our 1827 barn. We've got a lovely evening tonight. August, it's good to see ya. If you don't know me, my name's Kimberly Nealand, and I'm the speaker series coordinator among plenty of other things here at Wright-Locke Farm. And if you've been to a speaker series session before, you're familiar with how we do things. Just to kind of give you a general overview of Wright-Locke Farm, for those of you who are not as familiar with us, we are a nonprofit community farm here. The organization is only 11 years old, but doing lots of good things, I like to think at this point. Our mission is to build broad community and seek to model sustainable practices through active learning, organic agriculture, land stewardship, and an appreciation of our historic New England farm. So here we do a lot of different things, being, kind of in the heart of Winchester, and, there are people who live right near us. So I like to say we're a gateway farm. We've got little things for everybody to get involved with. So we have our organic agriculture. We grow on about 2 acres of land. We do 2 farmers markets, the Lexington and Winchester Farmers Market. We do a small CSA. We also have our farm stand on the property. So, we're always doing things with our chickens, our goats, our organic veg, and our organic flowers. So that's kind of the backbone of our farm, but we do a lot of education for youth and adults. This is one of our great programs for that's free to the public. We're in the midst of all of our week-long youth programs going on in the summertime. There were kids running through this barn earlier today, adding a lot of energy to our landscape. And we also had a big volunteer group who actually came over from Vietnam. And so they had 30 folks working in the fields with Adrian, our farmer, and our former board president, Sally, was giving them a tour, and it was great. So we do a lot of volunteer work here as well. We encourage people to get their hands dirty, to come and get involved here at the farm in a myriad of ways. And then besides our education, we also do a lot of different events, both public and private. So tomorrow, if you were here at this time, there might be 900 other people here with us for our free family concert series, Family Farm Night. So we do a lot of stuff there. People also rent out our lovely space that we're so happy to have available. But there's a wedding here this weekend. 40th birthday parties, it's all good. So we love interacting with the community in so many different ways. We are also open to the public, so I welcome you to come back to the farm at any point in time, maybe not at midnight, but at any daylight hours. We also have beautiful trails in the back if you haven't already explored, but a lot of conservation land out there. So it's just been a wonder to be part of this farm. I've been here for 6 years, and it's been amazing to see just how it's grown and how much support there is via our volunteers, our community, all the really dedicated and passionate staff members. And we're just really excited to be proud and help be part of this movement towards knowing and protecting the ecosystems around us, promoting healthy and meaningful lifestyles, and cultivating an engaged community that can expand our mission and be able to take and be even more impactful than we already are. So you guys are an important part of that engaged community, and I hope that tonight you'll take what you learned from tonight, apply it, start conversations about it, and investigate more about it, and keep this dialogue going. So that's kind of what the speaker series is all about and was created for. And of course, I welcome you to come back at any time, come visit the farm and maybe interact in a different way. And we've got plenty of information up on our website too about the different ways that you can get involved. I'm really excited to have Allison here tonight. She's a soil and plant and natural world enthusiast. I love that phrasing, it's so good and so true to who you are. She recently wrote the Carbon Sequestering Garden, Gardening for the Planet while growing some of the best food possible. She has played many roles over the past few years as a gardener, farmer, teacher, writer, mother, and naturalist, including former Director of Horticulture at Green City Growers in Somerville, where she wrote the gardening guide, The Urban Bounty, How to Grow Fresh Food Anywhere. She currently works at Northeast Organic Farming Association with the Soil Technical Assistance Program. And Allison is no stranger to the farm. She's attended many of our past speaker sessions, has led a couple of workshops here, and was involved with the planning and the beginnings of our agroforestry initiative, which are actually this weekend. We're going to start getting the holes ready for our orchard, our trees up on the hillside. So that's slowly coming along. So anyways, we are so pleased to have Allison here. So I hope you will help me welcome her to the barn stage today.
Well, so glad to be here. Really excited to talk with you all about what you can do in your own backyard and specifically climate resilience. So we'll see how much we can get through, and I know that there's probably a huge number of people who have a lot of different background information, all sorts of resources. So I at the end, Kim is going to be sending out. I have a handout in the back. I don't have enough for everybody, but those handouts are going to be sent out electronically as well. So also if there's any other information that kind of pops up, maybe we can all kind of synthesize that at the end as well. So really excited to be here. Oh, yeah, excellent. All right, so just to give you a sense of what I'm going to cover. So first, I'm just going to do a quick overview of why gardens are so essential. We're going to dive a little bit and kind of do a little bit of big picture, and then dive in to a much smaller scale of why, kind of the nitty-gritty of what exactly is happening specifically in the soil beneath our feet, but also in the plant and animal, kind of the whole ecosystem, and just give you a sense of all the different pieces that are the players in that space. Then we're going to go into a handful of tips on specifically how you build soil carbon in your own backyard in the soil, how you measure if you are succeeding at that, and then also just another look about different angles, putting those principles into practice with a handful of examples, as well as sort of a different angle on how to look at how you could do this better in your own backyard. So it's a lot of pieces to cover, but we'll see how we do. And if we have any questions during, I know we're going to have some time at the end, but if something comes up or if there is a question during the slides, feel free to ask it. I'd love to connect back and forth. So, for it. Perfect. So just to start off, so this is, as anyone, I know a couple years ago, a book came out called it was basically biodiversity in a cubic foot. And photographer David Litzwager ended up putting a cubic foot, this sort of green structure, in a bunch of different environments around the world. And he counted everything that he could see with his eye in that cubic foot for 24 hours. And so this is just in a park in Cape Town, South Africa. And he basically went through, and if you imagine your own yard, and if you were to stick a little cube right in there, just a square cubic foot, and if you were to put it down and try to count out everything, every little grub, maybe earthworm or two, and what you'd see, how many species do you think you would find? This is specifically Cape Town, South Africa, a small park. Any guesses on how much you'd find? This is not microscopic, but 50? Anybody else? 150? All right, we'll try this one. So this is what he found. This is 113 species, so very, very close. Very nice. So if you look at this whole system, there are just a lot of different creatures in here. If any one of these creatures was not in that cubic foot, it wouldn't collapse. You wouldn't have any problems necessarily. But every time you also moved over, one thing he noted about this space is when he moved over just another foot, half these species were completely different. So the incredible amount of diversity that is in a cubic foot is quite astounding. This is in Costa Rica. It's in a tree. So if you think about it, it's not in the soil. It's up in the air. There's probably no soil in there. But does anyone have any guess how many species in a tree in Costa Rica? 200? You're right, you get some good guesses. So this was 144 species. And if you look at this, there's actually a huge number of, there, smileys are pointing. There's actually a number of also birds as well. And if you think about when you're looking at an ecosystem, and all these different creatures and all these different species that are in there, oftentimes when you just look at that tree, you don't see them. But they kind of come in and out of that little space. These birds are kind of dependent on this whole host of bugs, plants, different species of plants, all these different things. So there's an enormous amount of biodiversity in these ecosystems. He also did one for coral reefs, which was, does anyone have a guess? I don't have that one up here, but does anyone have a guess of what he found in a coral reef? It's over 400 species. So just an incredible amount of diversity in that 3D kind of water environment. So that's just a kind of an exciting piece of that. So there was a journalist a couple years ago who did the same experiment in a cornfield in Iowa, and he was really curious of what he would find. Because there's a lot of green, but just curious on what the numbers were. And so he set out a square for 24 hours, and this is what he found. He actually couldn't find what he needed to in that square, and so he actually had to crawl from row to row to find nine different species, not including all the corn. But I'm just going to read this quickly. There were no bees, the air, the ground seemed vacant. He found one ant so small you couldn't pin it to a specimen board. A little later, crawling to a different row, he found one mushroom the size of an apple seed. Then later, a cobweb spider eating a crane fly, only one. A single red mite the size of a dust mote hurrying across the barren earth. Some grasshoppers, and that's it. So he crawled and crawled and found nothing else. So just that is just a huge diversity change. And usually we think about agriculture as being a huge part of the problem. But I will just say that in general, when we're looking at ecosystems, we are not much better in our backyards. And oftentimes, if you look at this area for its amount of food that it produces, there's not a lot of flowers, there's not a lot of blossoms, or any kind of engagement. There's not a lot of different levels. So just something to be really aware of. And we also have a tendency to use species of grass that also don't go very deep either. So we have a very, very limited diversity on a very, very shallow surface level. On average, the average farmer, or actually the average yard owner, this is homes, golf courses, and parks, use more pesticides per acre than the average piece of farmland. We also tend to grow more turf grass in this country than corn, wheat, and fruit trees combined. So we have a huge amount of turf and turf grass that is has its various challenges. But so what I'm trying to get across is that gardens matter, and not only do they matter, but they're incredibly essential. So our gardens now, at this time in history, are more important than ever. They are these pathways. They have a huge amount of potential for pollinator support, especially in the city. They act as migration corridors. So we have this unique potential in a very fragmented ecosystem to have flows of animals, and essentially, if you think about a migration as like a nutrient flow as well, they really are bringing lots of life behind them. So just think about kind of those things as we go along. But gardens also air and water purification, carbon sequestration, drought and flood resistance when they're kind of at that peak. Pest and disease resistance, fostering beneficial bug habitat, regional ecosystem resilience. There's just a huge amount of capacity in a garden, and they are more essential than they ever have been. Does anyone know what this flower is by any chance? Potato, yeah. So this is a potato flower. Bumblebees love it. This is actually on a garden balcony on a 3rd floor. Somehow bees and all sorts of things are coming up to this balcony garden. This was actually one of my gardens years ago. So it's just kind of an amazing thing that in a very, very small setting, you can get an enormous amount of traffic from different creatures. So So the players, we have, when you are going outside and just see all these different plants growing, they seem very quiet, very unassuming, not a lot happening necessarily, but there's actually an enormous amount happening below ground. So these plants, they capture sunlight and they use carbon dioxide and water through photosynthesis, and they break it down into sugars. So they build sugars, and what they do, one thing that we're finding out now is that they actually send a huge amount of those sugars down through their roots and exude them out through their roots. So they don't even use all the sugars they produce in a healthy soil ecosystem. They actually send them out through their roots, and we're finding out now, more than ever, that actually there's this massive community of microorganisms underneath those root systems in that rhizosphere or root zone. And there's a huge back and forth exchange that's going on. Those plants are in exchange for sending out those roots. They're actually getting all sorts of nutrients back. So one player in this whole system is mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi is a beneficial fungi that lives underground in the soil. It has a relationship with many different types of plants. And what it does, it actually extends the reach of the plant's roots many, 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 many times, like up to 100 times or more. In multiple different directions. And what the mycorrhizal fungi does is it brings water to the plant when it needs it, so it kind of is an extra drought resistance. It can actually mine rocks that contain nutrients that plants can't access, and depending on what soil tests you get, those nutrients don't even show up on weak acid soil tests. So it's essentially getting a huge amount of nutrients that don't even show up on one of your soil tests, which is incredible. So my background, I have a background in geology, and I got really interested in soil from very much a chemical and physical perspective, a lot of those properties, and now one thing I find incredibly exciting is that we're just starting to understand that biology is coming into that as well. And so there's this huge interplay. It's a very complex ecosystem. In there, one thing also about mycorrhizal fungi, which I think is really neat, is they actually will take some of those carbon liquid sugars, which they depend on, but they can't manufacture. So they have these very complex relationships with roots. They will actually also exude something called glomalin, which is like a sticky glue, and it actually helps form soil particles. So it'll glue together aggregates, and those aggregates, or that stickiness in the soil, helps in times of drought. It actually holds water, it holds structure, and it also helps hold the environments that other soil life are in. So you get this incredible network of things. Mycorrhizal fungi and a couple other fungi also put out enzymes that can actually rip apart organic pollutants. So things like DDT and other things, they can actually, the enzymes can rip them apart to kind of neutral or not hydrocarbons, all those different things. They can rip them apart, those long carbon chains, into neutral components. So it's just this incredible world that is living beneath the soil, and it's all fueled by sunlight. So these, and not to mention, there's a whole, just a huge amount of things, but if a plant gets injured, mycorrhizal fungi can send signals through the network and actually trigger plants to boost up an immune response all the way across the garden or in other sections. And these mycorrhizal networks can actually extend very, very, very far. And so plants will actually, in response, will trigger, they can make resistance compounds and also get all sorts of compounds also from soil bacteria, not just mycorrhizal fungi, but there's a whole host of players in the soil. So this is a big, big world that's happening and incredibly complex. Yes.
How deep would that be obtained?
So essentially, this there's a higher percentage of creatures in activity right where the roots are. Yeah. However, anywhere that the roots are putting out sugars, you get activity. And so up higher, you get more air and lighter soil and other things, and as you go down lower and maybe in the deeper fractions, you don't as much, but you still get a pretty active back and forth. So essentially, plants, they're exuding out these sugars, which is liquid carbon, into the soil, and not all of that is going to stay in the soil. but it basically feeds and fuels this massive underground community. So this is very impressive thing. And then you see there's a little tiny little bug up here. I just want to say one thing about bugs. I love bugs. I think they're amazing. But there's I'll say again.
They love your PowerPoint.
They do. Apparently it's a lot earlier. So a lot of times when we think about bugs or insects, we do actually think of them as pests. But a very, very tiny fraction of all the bugs out there are actually pests. Most of them, a huge proportion of them, are actually working very quietly, underground, above ground. They're oftentimes go unheard, unseen. And they are the fuel for most of our ecosystem. They are recyclers, they're shredders, they do all sorts of incredible things. And so I'll just put that out there as well. Also, all living forms of life are made, as we know it, are made of carbon. And so if you think about a lot of the life in the soil also as a carbon source, it's not something you can really measure because it goes in and out of flux as things live and die. But if you think about giant amounts of biomass, it is carbon. And so if you think about, just keep a very broad perspective of what you think of as carbon. So just as we go through, I just wanted to mention that as well. So this is a soil food web. So if you think about our little plants over here that are very quietly, again, fueling this massive underground environment, they also, so there's all this stuff that's kind of fueling that. I just want to mention just very, very quickly, every time there's this huge host of creatures that are in the underground world. So this bacteria, protozoa, we'll give this just a quick example. Protozoa are little predators, and they will go after bacteria. Every time that a protozoan eats a bacteria, it's like ripping open a fertilizer bag. So you are essentially, because the protozoa has a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than bacteria. Bacteria is a lot higher in the nitrogen category. It doesn't use all that nitrogen. And so essentially you are enabling, every time, the more activity you have in this web, you are actually opening up and making very plant available fertilizers in that environment. In bacteria, also one of the things that's really neat about this environment is that the biology also acts as a really nice buffer. So if you have a huge amount of nutrients coming off, if you have a very active community, that biology can hold a lot of those nutrients in the soil actively. And so you don't get the same level of runoff if you have a very biologically active, healthy, thriving soil that has a lot of good structure. Also, I'll just mention that earthworms, which are not on this chart, but they also love protozoa and fungi and all those other things. So they're incredible indicators, especially in a farmer garden environment, of a very diverse soil biology. So just keeping that in mind, and also these guys right here, this lower half, they fuel these guys. So these upper things, and you'll notice birds and animals up here, and also us, these guys fuel and sustain all of us. And so the bigger and healthier this whole group is, it just builds up that food and that support. And so life, in some senses, creates the conditions for more life. And so now we're going to go just into building soil carbon. Even though there's that entire, very complex, incredible world, the principles behind building soil carbon are actually really simple. And that's the part that I think is very inspiring to me. So this area right here, oh, sorry, there we go. Oh no, wait a minute. Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. So this plant right here, if you look at all those clumps, these little clumps and bits, that those are soil aggregates. And this is an example, when you see something like that, when you pull up a plant and it's got all those clumps, and even if you see roots that look like they have a coating of soil on them, that's an indicator for biological activity. That's an indicator that sugars are going out through the roots and you get that exchange. So when you're looking in your garden, really take a look and see what color the soil is, look and see if you get that crumbly, nice structure. See what it looks like. And so these are just kind of, we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these just somewhat quickly. There's many, 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 many different examples of ways to do this. So if anyone has any other ideas, love to make sure we get those at the very end. But yeah, so this is cover the soil surface. That's a basic one. Minimize soil disturbance. Plant diversity. so that means plant many different species, and maintain continual or live plants or roots in the soil. So covering the soil, another way you can say it is armoring your soil. Soil is, when it's bare, it has high potential for oxidizing carbon, among other things. And so bare soil is not something that nature likes to have happen. So the first thing it'll try to do is grow weeds or grow something to cover the soil, because that is really, really, really important in nature to keep it covered. Part of the reason is that when soil is covered, not only are you keeping the soil surface cooler or kind of more moderated from the weather extremes, protecting it from wind, all those different things, but you're also protecting it from rain. Rain is actually surprisingly challenging for a soil. When it falls, it has an incredible amount of impact, and you have a great potential for washing away soil. So when rain falls on bare soil, it oftentimes, it kind of allows the soil kind of forms a crust to protect itself. And the ironic thing is when you start forming crusts, you also start forming the capacity for less water to soak in as well. So it's this kind of challenging back and forth, but really armoring the soil, protecting it, is really, really important. Another way to think about it is to slow water down as much as possible. So especially if you have slopes or areas where you have a tendency to have a lot of runoff, so this is a good time to kind of observe what you've got in your garden. But it's really, really important to slow it down and give the water a chance to soak in for as much as possible. Also, one of the things, and you'll notice some of these are carbon sources like shredded leaves and wood chips, and there's also cocoa hulls, so the straw, all sorts of different things, but it can be living or these kind of denser carbon sources. But they also feed the soil microbiology. So you, as these are breaking down, they actually are also fueling this very hungry soil community. So soil is really good at just digesting and eating and using carbon as an energy source. It doesn't necessarily mean it will stay in there, the carbon in your soil. However, getting that system active is the way to build long-term carbon, and specifically humus. So it's thinking about how to do that and keep it going and get that activity and that biology going is really, really important. Second one is minimizing soil disturbance, and actually I'll just mention these principles are from the Natural Resources Conservation Services, NRCS, and they have a soil health division, which is fantastic. They have a huge number of resources on their site on soil health, and they also have a short video series. So that's NRCS Soil Health Division, and they so these are their principles, which I think really capture the essence of what it looks like to build soil in your backyard. And there's a couple others. You can kind of expand these to many different things to apply to the garden as well. And also to a farm setting. But I just think these are really, really fantastic. So this just real quick is, again, keep doing that. This is a little pine sapling, and so you'll see the roots right here without mycorrhizal fungi. It doesn't extend very far, but you'll see the network, just the amount that mycorrhizal fungi extends the reach of the plant roots and also puts in an amount of resilience. So the thing that is tricky about fungi is they're very slow growing. And so when you disturb the soil, when you break it up, you can actually break up these networks very easily, and it does take a little bit longer for it to come back. Bacteria is fast growing, so if you have an extreme drought with a kind of broken up soil structure, or if you have any of these other disturbances like winter, or any number of other things, then it does, so bacteria is the first thing to come back, which is a great thing in many ways. That's what it's good at. But bacterially dominant soils tend to be more weed prone, and they tend to grow some of those first succession plants. Whereas if you can get those fungal networks, you actually can start building soils that are more, they kind of grow grasses or some of our vegetables actually do very, very, very well in that more balanced fungal bacterial role. And in a very highly dominant fungal ratio, then you get those old growth forests. So we kind of want somewhere in the middle right there. I also mentioned just on here that chemical pesticides are also on here as a soil disturbance. They're a chemical disturbance. They tend to, they can really completely disable the soil community. So a fungicide doesn't just get the fungi that you want, it gets everything. So they're not tailored to just get the bad stuff. And as soon as you remove, say, your mycorrhizal fungi, which is a beneficial fungi, you actually remove a part of your plant's immune system. So just be really, really, really mindful of anything that you're using that is an herbicide, a pesticide, fungicide. All these different categories of things can really disable huge portions of your soil biology, and in some cases, they can actually unintentionally create a bigger pest or other issue as well. Mm-hmm.
So does that include things that are marketed as organic?
So a lot of one thing that's really interesting about organic pesticides is that they so it does include some of those, but I think it really depends on what you are using them for. So one of the things that makes an organic pesticide, what they try to do is they try to look for things that have a less heavy impact. So the idea is that they're still very strong and they can still disable parts of the community, the soil web community, but a lot of organic pesticides are geared towards trying to target a very specific thing. So, like for example, BT is a soil microbe that's sprayed on plants, and it doesn't last for very long, but if bugs in their larval form eat it, they kind of, it's a bacterium that causes their insides to kind of liquefy. So it's very effective in kind of dosage, but so for example, like when it's applied large scale, so like BT corn, it actually, that bacterium, the toxin that it produces inside the creature's gut is actually put into the corn. And so just eating the corn ends up having that impact. So it's not quite the same thing as the bacterium application. So in general, pesticides have negative consequences. A lot of the organic ones they try to have a testing review board to try to minimize their impacts, but they do still have impacts, if that's answers that question.
And how about organic fertilizers?
So organic fertilizers, thank you for mentioning that. So this is, so very specifically, synthetic fertilizers are, and thank you for answering that question. So synthetic fertilizers in particular are, they're oftentimes salts. So if you think of things like Miracle-Gro or other things, also potassium chloride is a really intense one. It does work, but it also disables your soil, so it prematurely weathers your soil so that it's less able to hold nutrients. These kind of receptor sites for all these nutrients are less, it kind of weathers them away. So you actually reduce your soil's capacity year after year. So this is not organic. This is not organic ones. However, if you are putting in, I would say that, for example, any nitrogen application, anytime you put in a fertilizer application, you do kind of change the dynamics in the soil. If you're putting it, so a lot of organic fertilizers, one of their benefits, and this is when I'm talking about organic fertilizers, I'm talking about things that are kind of brown or, like oftentimes they're grainy, chicken manure or compost or other things. They actually have oftentimes a microbial component, or they're kind of geared towards being put on the soil, or as foliar sprays as well. And so those different pieces are actually they interact differently with the system. And so I'm not sure if I've explained that particularly well, but very specifically, a lot of synthetic fertilizers, what they'll do is they're very acidic. When they break down, they're salts, so they tend to drive away earthworms, they tend to break down soil structure, they tend to disable the food web. They do a lot of very, very negative things. Nitrogen fertilizer, the way we use it kind of commercially, tends to, it's really can be very damaging to the soil, completely disables the plant's community around its root network, and so it breaks down. And once the plant is kind of dependent on this very fast, very water, it's water soluble, meaning it dissolves readily in water. And so it's essentially you're drip feeding the plant nutrients. Organic fertilizers in general tend to be slower release. So oftentimes when you see on a packet of organic fertilizer, and you see those numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they're much lower than, say, the Miracle-Gro or other different things that are like 10, 10, 10 or 20, 20, 20. They're much, much higher, and that usually is an indicator. Those slower release things are very, very important for kind of buffering. So fertilizers are important and useful and very important, but being able to kind of specifically chemical fertilizers and pesticides are something you want to avoid. So thank you for
Biochar.
say again.
Biochar.
Biochar. We'll talk a little bit about biochar in a bit. Yeah, but it's also a very good, great amendment.
Organic is not strictly defined.
No, it's not. And so.
Used.
Yes, and that's also another piece of it. So very specifically, when I'm talking about chemical pesticides and fertilizers, I'm talking about synthetic salts, very specifically. They also strip away calcium from the soil, all sorts of different things. So this is a very specific term of it. Also same with pesticides. There's a whole range of pesticides, but we're specifically talking about things that minimize soil disturbance. So again, when you're and again, this is also minimized. So there's a lot of different people who are building soil carbon in their yards and using some of these things in a very targeted way. And if you can, I would say in general, for a gardener or a backyard person, be very careful about what you're putting in your yard. But you can also, there are a handful of people who are practicing no-till, who are practicing a lot of different types of things that use chemical, pesticides and fertilizers in very targeted ways. A lot of them are trying to, the more they engage their biology, the less they have to use as well. So it's not a black or white topic. So thank you for, it's very important to kind of clarify that, and that's oftentimes something that I think is going to be challenging. I'm going to move on because I know that there's a lot of different pieces, but if there are any more questions about that, please feel free to bring them up at the end as well. Also, just in terms of soil disturbance, just all these different, all these different kind of extreme things, and you notice compaction is also on there. So again, an area where if you don't have a lot of air in the soil, you also don't have a lot of life, you need air, you need water, and you need kind of soil life to kind of activate all this. And if you don't have air, that's another challenge. So basically, maximize conditions for soil life to thrive. Plant diversity. One thing that is fascinating to me is every single plant has a different community of microbes underneath it that it fosters. So when it puts out, some of these root exudates, it actually will foster a completely unique community of microorganisms. We are barely scratching the surface of what exactly those ranges are, but we've actually found also that blends of plants actually they start having positive benefits when you're kind of growing lots of different plants together, but when you start growing a large diversity, you get this huge compounding benefit of all these communities. You get this thing called quorum sensing, so you have enough bacteria, a trigger of a population that's high enough, and you suddenly get these positive benefits. It's a really unique thing that's happening all around underneath these plant roots. So in doing that, I'm trying to include a really high diversity of plants. Think about not only just the diversity above ground, but also think about a diversity of variety of root depths. Not every plant has a really large root depth system, and I hate to pick on turf again, but Kentucky bluegrass, which I will also say is not from Kentucky, is actually not even a native to North America, is renamed, but it has an incredibly short root system. And there are a lot of other even native grasses that actually have much, much deeper root systems that are really good here, that are an excellent replacement as well. So just putting that out there, this is just a couple of different prairie grasses, in particular prairie plants. And one of the things that's really unique about prairie grasses and plants is that they have incredibly long root systems. And so everywhere that there are roots, you get some amount of biology exchange. And so, going even down to these very tips, they're essentially they're sort of soil builders in many ways. So we used to think of plants as very passively in the soil community, and now we're kind of understanding them to be a much more active player. So experiment with intercropping and companion planting. Some companion planting, actually, you have these incredible benefits where it just boosts yield and boosts all these different things. Cocktail cover crops is, some of you might have heard, that's oftentimes a farm term, cover cropping, but it also is basically it's a blend of certain things, and there have been people who've done research on what's the minimum number of diverse species you need of what types that give you that that kind of give that compounding benefits. And there's some really interesting research on that as well. There's new stuff coming out all the time, but again, diversity, especially in a backyard. So one thing you can do is you can actually plant things on the edges, incorporate different varieties, even just different species of grass in a lawn, but also broadleaf plants, all these different things. If you can get that diversity up, it really makes a huge difference below ground. And remember, this is also improving drought and flood resistance as well by building up its carbon-rich soil sponge, essentially. So that is also really important. So for every 1% increase in organic matter in the soil, you're also increasing, so per acre, you increase the soil's capacity to hold water by 20,000 gallons. That's a number from NRCS. And that's huge. So for a fifth of an acre yard, that's 4,000 gallons of water. I mean, it's just an incredible amount. I think that ends up translating to 72 55-gallon rain barrels in a fifth of an acre yard, 1% increase in organic matter. So if you think about all these yards that are starting to build up a little bit, the amount of flood resilience, the drought resilience, also same with drought, you'd think that that much more storage capacity of water, well, doesn't it have that much more thirst? Well, it actually holds the water better for longer. And can actually handle drying out much, much, much more as well, and rebounds very quickly. So that's just, in my mind, very exciting. When you are able to plant native plants have really unique relationships with our native biome, specifically our insects. And so the number of native plants, they oftentimes just have a huge number more species that they support. Even plants that have been around here, non-native plants that have been around for a while, it just takes a very long time for that insect population to translate over to be able to kind of use them and actively work with them. And so it really does, especially and we don't even know what native plants do for our soil microbiome, the amount of species that they support underground as well. So just keep that in mind when you're planting. And there's a lot of, when you're able to, it can make a huge difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So maintain living live plants or roots in the soil for as much of the year as possible. You're essentially keeping that food source going all year round, as much of the year as possible. So keeping up and keeping alive that soil microbial community. You're also trying to maximize sunlight capture. So if you think about a lot of perennial plants, they bulk up their storage of food source in their roots. And so they have the capacity to emerge earlier. They can emerge because they have this, compared to perennials, which, plants that come back year after year versus annuals, which need to be planted each year. Perennials have this capacity to weather harder conditions because they have that stored biomass underground as well, and also in their plant parts as well. So just thinking about that when you do that. So again, perennials, there is a fantastic new books also there's one book called Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tonsmeyer, and he actually talks about all these different vegetables that we can actually plant. We don't usually think of vegetables perennially, but there's a huge number of them. Asparagus is a classic one that we love, rhubarb, but there's also a lot of kind of untapped vegetables as well. So just putting that out there, it's a great book if you're interested. So measuring success. So part of this is, in the fact that we're doing this, we're trying to also determine, are we succeeding? Are we actually having success there? It's really difficult to measure soil carbon. There's a lot of different tests out there. They test different things. But I will say that there's a handful of ways, indicators. So each of these things are indicators for success on their own. They're not necessarily, won't tell you that that soil is increasing. For example, earthworm counts, if you've just put down a lot of compost, you might see earthworm numbers bump up, and it may not be necessarily a direct indicator for long-term carbon building. However, and as you build up and see indicators across a lot of these tests, they're really simple tests you can do in your backyard, you can actually see benefits as well, more long-term as well. And one of the benefits of measuring soil is that you get to track how it changes. And noticing some of those differences and being able to articulate that and see the differences is really, really, really important. I think now and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's hugely important to be able to kind of document that success. And let people know kind of where progress is. In the face of climate change, it can be a really overwhelming problem, but when you start seeing those changes and actually that building, it can make a big difference. So this is the Slate Test, which is kind of an interesting one. You can also do this. It's basically testing aggregate strength. So somebody has basically taken a soil aggregate from a really healthy, active soil biology, and then also a clump of soil that is not as active biology-wise, and you can see, so what they've done is they actually take a little bit of chicken wire and they lower the aggregate into the water. This one is completely dissolved, except for this little tiny bump here, whereas this aggregate is completely stable. So it has an enormous amount of resistance to water and a huge amount of structure. So think of that as a carbon-rich sponge that can really moderate and be kind of resistant to compaction, to any number of different things when you're able to build that structure into the soil. Let's see, here we go. Noticing what you have, again, just like looking at how soil coats roots, and also just notice color, notice what you have to start with. Just making observations of what's in your soil, digging a hole, kind of finding what's there, seeing what's under plant roots. Just take some time to get to know what your soil feels like. If you have a natural clay, any number of different factors, but kind of noticing how it changes over time. And again, this is a very simplistic kind of diagram, but just noticing again the soil life and the plant relationship is very much kind of the base of a pyramid, and if you have good soil health, it really supports this huge insect and arthropod community, which again supports birds, tons of different animals, and also us. We're in this little tiny category at the top, but if you have a poor soil community, you really do shrink that pyramid. So just thinking about our ecosystem and us as a part of it is also really important. Looking at increasing topsoil depth, if you watch for color changes, this is sort of some of the indicators. This is a golf course, and if you look at this tiny little bit of fraction, oftentimes this darker color, here's a much bigger, this is a soil profile, you can see the distinctive colors. Usually the colors aren't quite that distinctive, but sometimes they're very, very stark. So this is the topsoil right here. Noting how deep this is, if this changes over time and gets deeper, that's an awesome thing. And if you're getting darker colors down where the plant roots are penetrating, that's you're kind of getting that life and activity and that carbon in there. So carbon looks like it's darker, richer, light, crumbling, sweet-smelling soils. So those are signs of a really healthy, thriving soil, and also with a lot of life in it. So also, again, looking for aggregate connection. So one thing you can do for aggregates is you can actually pull up a plant, or a clump of plants, even let's say if you have a grass, and then you thwomp it on the ground, and you can even do it again, and just see how many are remaining. And those aggregates that are kind of holding onto the plant roots, that's a very simple way of kind of just judging what's the average size of those aggregates. Are they big? Are they small? Are they tiny little pea size? And is it changing over time? So that's a way to kind of do it on a kind of a thicker scale, not so much individual plants, but earthworm counts. So I will say just earthworms are higher on that food web. They love eating many of the things like protozoa. They love eating fungi, all these different types of things, and so they're really, really good indicators in a garden in particular for success. They also are incredible tillers, so they actually will make lots and lots and lots of little holes. So if you're doing minimal disturbance, when it rains, they are incredible at reducing compaction and building that up.
This is a good time to tell people not to let earthworms go in the forest.
Yes, so earthworms in the forest is a totally different thing. Our forests did not evolve with earthworms. They take a lot of organic matter down. Yes, so, but it is also, it's one of those very challenging things.
Stuff.
Yes, they do, yeah. So, but this is also, so I guess earthworm counts from gardens perspectives. When I think of earthworms, I'm thinking also tillable land. There are huge numbers of them that can come, especially in kind of areas that are tillable. So just keep that in mind. Also, when you are doing, I think, shovelfuls of soil in the garden specifically, if you get on the order of like 25 earthworms per shovelful, which is a very high level, that's a really, really, really biologically active soil. And I know some folks who count that as their metric. That is a huge number. I also mentioned that earthworms tend to show up higher in numbers in wet years. So, and we also do have a couple native worms that are not earthworms specifically, but other native worms that do live in soil. So it's an interesting community, and there's a whole big debate about there are many challenges. So just be mindful if you have a forest ecosystem that this may not be what you're wanting. But specifically open land, they can be really, really helpful. Soil hardness, so this is a really interesting one. It could be as simple as taking a rod and seeing if you can get it to sink in your ground. Very hard soils, say in California, that have done a lot of really intense things. The soils get caliche, that khaki color. In some cases, you can get to the point where you can barely put the soil in, like even just like a half an inch, quarter of an inch. Like I think it's so hard. So soils can be incredibly hard, and especially if they've been turned over a lot. If they've gotten a lot of rain and bare soils, all those pieces, they really can struggle. Lastly, so just it also can be useful for finding hard pans or kind of thick areas. When you are also building up a really, really fantastic soil, what you'll notice is that soils that used to have a really difficult, hard area, well, actually you can sometimes take a rod and just push it all the way in, and it can go down really far. And if you're getting that kind of tilt in your soil, that's an incredible thing. So I'll just mention that. Also, water infiltration is a really big one. So keep in mind, different soils have different natural capacities for water infiltration. So this is not by itself an indicator. So for example, beach sand also has good water infiltration, but it also doesn't have a lot of organic matter. So this is, again, an indicator, not a tried and true thing. So you're looking for changes over time. And I have seen lawns that they take over 50, 60 minutes to infiltrate an inch of water. And you think, because there's all this grass on top, you really think that it would go down a little bit faster, but it's just shockingly, it just stays there. And so it can make it can be a very, very, very good indicator of how much pore space you have, how much biology is in there. And so just keep that in mind when you're looking for it. I've also seen it can really be a really interesting indicator for what your soil practices are as well. A biodiversity count is a very simple one. So one easy way to do this is just take a hula hoop and put it on a representative patch of your soil, especially if you have like a lawn or something, and just see how many different plant species you have and do those change over time. So again, thinking back to the biodiversity cubic foot, like does that change? Can you countable things that, even if you don't know all the species, just identify different ones. Also, there's some really interesting tools like iNaturalist that can allow you to track new species and participate in citizen science programs. So they're really excellent for tracking new species, and they have really good ID apps now. So you can take a picture of a bug, fungi, plant, all these things, and a community of people can help you verify the identification. So does anyone know what this is right here? This is, I found this on the backside of a kale in the fall, which I thought this was really neat. This was in a corporate garden by the highway, and so I was really excited to see it. It's papery. Any guesses? So this is praying mantis egg sac, which is, I've never seen them on kale before, but there was nowhere else to go. And this, I actually found the female. who laid it, and it's a high indicator of soil or kind of a more robust ecosystem. Praying mantises need a certain amount of creatures to eat, and so it's just really neat that we saw something like this. So just putting that out there is just like keep an eye out for what you're seeing in there. When you are able to support big predators like this, you can also reduce the pest pressure on your thing. So I know we're getting close to time, and I just want to quickly go through just a few different ideas, strategies for soil building and how to put these principles into practice. There are many strategies out there and many different ideas. So I just want to run through a couple different new lenses for looking at things. This picture right here is actually kale with an undercover of buckwheat. This is someone in New York who is trying out different cover crops as a, so he had some kale starts that he ended up, this has been heavily harvested kale, and then putting and establishing a low-growing cover. Buckwheat is a cover crop that is really good at germinating in the heat. It also produces, it gets to maybe about a foot tall, is easy to mow down or cut back and makes a great mulch. And it also has a really nice pollinator top flower, so beautiful flowers as well, that are great for pollinators. Actually, this is buckwheat here. So cover crops are usually something we think of for farms, and that's often true, but there are some that are really great for backyards, and they have, one thing that's interesting about cover crops is they're also called workhorse plants. They oftentimes have really unique characteristics, and that's why they become cover crops. So for example, clover is nitrogen fixing. One thing that's really fascinating about clover's engagement in the soil is it actually helps mobilize nutrients and kind of make certain nutrients more available, like calcium, in the soil. Kind of that host of microorganisms around the roots can really do incredible things for making nutrients more available. So they are also, like this white clover up at the top is an excellent garden pathway plant, also a pollinator support. Daikon is another one that is known for its soil disease suppression and also soil boring capacity. So it's also very good for breaking up hardpans. Field peas are something that I recently got introduced as for a gardener. They are incredibly easy to pull up, and you can essentially grow them at the base of your soil. And again, it's mobilizing all those different things. The edible shoots, or the young shoots, are edible, but they can also be pulled up really easily and then laid down as your own mulch in and around crops. So they're really good in the spring. And again, nitrogen fixing. A bunch of these are legumes. Buckwheat, again, really great for growing in the summertime. It does really well in the heat. And then ryegrass is also in here, and one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, specifically with ryegrass, is disease suppression. It also does, and also it has a really dense root structure, so that it is very good at holding, even if it dies back. So ryegrass is very different than rye. Winter rye is a hardy perennial that's often grown on farms, and it's very good on its own level. But ryegrass is it's a weaker, it's a soft, it oftentimes a winter kill. Not always here, depending on our winters, but you can also mow it, so you can use it in your lawns, and it also holds a lot of excess nitrogen. So if you're in a place that is getting a lot of nitrogen runoff, say from a neighboring golf course or park or other things, or a neighbor that has a lot of nitrogen fertilizer use, it's really good for protecting waterways. So just different crops, these are different ways of using them. This is one example of minimizing disturbance from the University of Vermont. What they did is they put daikon in the ground in August or September in rows that they wanted to plant the next crops. And this is what it looked like in the spring. The daikon essentially melts away. If you leave it, you can also harvest however many you want, but daikon can grow really well. So this is after kind of the summer crops are waning, you can plant it. It has this really unique capacity to suppress weeds. And so this is no weeding. No weeding happened in this bed. It completely suppresses the weed growth, and so you get sort of a fresh thing. So this is a perfect place to put onion starts or early spring starts straight into those holes, and then you can kind of get started again. So there's a lot of potential with cover crops, we're just starting to learn them and also finding those techniques that make them really easy to use and kind of get their extra benefits. Minnesota, I just saw an article talking about this program where they are funding people to plant bee lawns. And there is, so the rusty patch bumblebee is the first bee in the continental United States to get listed as an endangered species. This is him down here. And it's making a last stand in the Midwest, which is a very intense thing, but there are people who are trying to fund people to plant diverse lawns, and they're calling them bee lawns. I added butterfly in here because I just wanted to put out, so this is the great spangled fritillary. So fritillary butterflies eat violets. Their caterpillars eat violets. They subsist on violets, and so if you have violets, you're more likely to have fritillaries. If you don't have them, then you don't. So a lot of caterpillars and butterflies have very, very unique relationships with certain plants. And so being, another one is eastern-tailed blues are these little cute butterflies. They eat clover. So there's huge amounts. Orange sulfurs eat alfalfa and other clovers as well. So there's like all these different things. The common buckeye eats sorrel and docks. So all these different things that actually can exist in a very diverse lawn. This is still mowable. You're not turning your area into a meadow, but it provides pollination support, food source, and gets that diversity going as well. So just thinking about outside of the box, and also kind of what other people in different parts of the country are doing to try to really boost up our biodiversity as well. Thinking about problems, any problem that you have in your yard, and trying to think about its other capacities. So for example, weeds. Weeds oftentimes are growing for a reason. And so stopping to think about them, instead of just being a pest or something to get rid of, just stop for a moment and just think about what are they trying to tell us. So for example, oftentimes weeds are early succession plants. They are really, really good hyperaccumulators of micronutrients. So some weeds grow on soils that are specifically deficient in certain things. So dandelions in particular are they're good at hyperaccumulating calcium. And they also have those super long taproots. They're good at punching through hardpan. And so if you think about conditions that if you're losing calcium, say the nitrogen fertilizers, like the chemical fertilizers, and you're also maybe, I don't know, creating, you're just putting grass onto a subsurface, you kind of are triggering these conditions for dandelions to continue to like try to get it right. And so if you think about what they're trying to do, you can oftentimes bypass the conditions that they're trying to help. Or you can work with them. So I know some people who will actually just do this chop and drop mulch. So they'll essentially go through and just chop the weeds at the base of their plants. So they're growing their regular plants that they're trying to grow, and they chop the weeds and just lay them down. And because essentially weeds do it very slowly, but they're trying to get the soil up to a higher level of functioning as well. So they're early succession plants. Also, weeds are really, so lamb's quarters, for example, competes with spinach for nutrition. It's right up there, sometimes surpassing it. Purslane is really high in omega-3s, vitamin A. Dandelion is really amazing for liver. All these different plants actually have these incredible medicinal properties, and at different times in history were actually thought of as, not as weeds, but as useful plants. So it's just interesting to think about that perspective as well. I mentioned minimizing soil compaction, but also for some soils you have to maximize disturbance in order to minimize it in the future. So specifically compacted soils, when you have no air, you don't have a lot of life in the soil, one of the best ways to kind of maximize conditions for soil to thrive is to get air, get water, get life in there, and so find ways to add life back into your soils rapidly. So a broad fork is one for those really highly compacted soils. Also, there's a number of people who will, especially for tree wells where they're really compacted soil, they'll actually inject compost tea into the tree wells to try to get that life in soil. So if you're already going in there, seeing if you can get that life speed or that life stuff into the soil as well. So I also put in biochar in here. It's very good with dealing with compaction. One thing I will say, just a warning of biochar, is if you're using it raw, it has a tendency to pull nutrients really quickly, and it's very, very good once it's inoculated. So it's hydrated, and it has things. So if you're able to put it through compost, for example, it's a great way to do it. If you just put it on raw, if you put on a little too much, it can make it look like a detriment. It will help eventually, but it can just kind of be tricky. You put it through a compost, you add minerals, you water, anything you can do to get life into it. So even if it's in a pile that you're kind of mixed with worm castings, do anything you can to just sort of give it a chance to load up and supercharge.
I'm sorry, what's biochar?
So biochar, that's a great question. So biochar is it's different than wood ash, but it's basically wood that's been or carbon material that's been heated without gas in there. So it's essentially in a contained space. So it's a process called pyrolysis, and it's basically a very stable form of carbon. And so it's this tiny, tiny, tiny little these pieces that end up having this incredible microbial structure to them. And so a lot of people are talking about using biochar as an amendment. So it's oftentimes a byproduct of certain heating systems. And so if you're able to get that piece, so a lot of like the Amazon, the terra preta, biochar is one of those kind of pieces that kind of built the rainforest soils that were able to support human life when rainforest soils are very, very, very shallow, and they were able to use those methods of an amendment in the soil that was able to support a huge amount of fertility. So it's a tool, but just kind of go slow with it if you're using it right away. So you can make it yourself too, yes. And there's actually some pretty easy ways to do that with just a can with a little hole in it and filled with whatever is in your fireplace or however it is. So there's a couple different ways, and I know a lot of resources also online for homemade biochar as well. There's also a lot of folks that do sell it now as well. Also, I will mention also plants with multiple functions at the very end. So hyperaccumulators like comfrey is also a really great thing. They are plants that tend to both be great pollinator plants, but also hyperaccumulate a lot of micronutrients as well. So there's just thinking about ways to mediate that. So there's a handful of, so a lot of people also do fermented brews as well to sort of unlock. I know horsetail is another one that has silicon, which is actually really good for plant cell wall building. So it's also another option for, so there are a lot of people who have done that. I definitely check it out because there are some really neat ways to unlock those nutrients and then add it back to your soil in a kind of a little more available form as well. Go ahead.
What about adding crushed eggshells?
Crushed eggshells are great. I think it's oftentimes on a farm setting. It's not usually a source, even though it's readily around. It's not usually one that's available, but it is fantastic. And a lot of soils around New England are calcium deficient, so I think it's a really, really great option. Calcium is absolutely essential for fruit formation. So a lot of our orchards, for example, are really, it's a huge nutrient that enables the mobilization of a lot of other nutrients in the soil as well. So it's an excellent resource. It's also, if you want to make it more available, you can crush it small, and then also if you put it through a compost, it works really well. And for gardeners, that's one thing you can do, incorporating inflows or minimizing outflows. Eggshells that come into your space are an amazing example of a really, really great nutrient that you can kind of break down and then just put into your space as well. So especially other things that produce fruit, but also soils in general. And calcium is really, really important for a number of different things. I'll just mention also, I know I talked briefly about capturing sunlight and maximizing sunlight capture. The other extreme of this is, a cornfield in Iowa. You plant your corn late. So you have a bare soil until May or whenever the soil warms up, depending on where you are. The soil grows, the corn grows till like knee-high in July. It's not that tall. So it's not, there's only so much photosynthesis that's happening in that corn stalk. And then by the time it's later in the summer, you're already getting some dieback from some of the leaves. So you're not really maximizing the potential for capturing sunlight, and sunlight is really what fuels this entire system. So if you think about your yard and your space as how do you maximize photosynthetic potential to feed your underground community, just thinking about that in another way. This is just an example of a forest garden, just talking about all the different levels, ground covers, vines, many, many different shrubs, and just thinking about how a forest or how natural systems respond, and how they kind of maximize that cover in a neat way. And as a gardener, you have this potential to really gear your plants towards, to also, feeding us, doing a lot of many, many uses as well. I'll also just mention, I mentioned the water example earlier and organic matter for holding water, but if you can, also thinking about incorporating inflows, if you can try to capture every single drop of water that falls on your land space, think about slowing it down so that the soil can absorb it. If you had a soil and a space that can do that, that makes a huge difference for the area around you. Just as a watershed, it purifies that water, it holds that water in the soil, and if your soil has the capacity to do that, that is an incredible thing. So just be thinking about ways to do this and think about some of these different strategies for maximizing the benefits. And I'm just going to end, this is the last thing, but I just heard about this spring, but I heard that so basically the UN declared a decade of ecosystem restoration, and just in this March, for the first time, so 2021 to 2030, this is an incredible opportunity, I think, for people everywhere, but gardeners, I think, have an incredible role in this part. And I, just as a note, it may not seem directly related, but a Winchester example, and I know our next speaker, the next speaker series is also going to be talking about the Mystic River, but this just blew my mind. It happened right here in our backyard, but the Mystic River has had a lot of challenges over the year, really low water quality, and was thought of as mostly more of a waste stream by a lot of communities with all the industrial pollution issues, and they, in the recent years, have been able not only to increase their water quality by cleaning up lots of different things, lots of different issues, but also they've been able to bring the herring back. And so for the first time in over 100 years, we are getting herring levels that they were estimating these years' numbers, and they're not in yet, but they thought that they might be over 1 million herring for the first time in over 100 years. And so with herring come bluefish, come osprey, come bald eagles, turtles, both sea turtles and turtles inland, freshwater turtles, eat small herring. So many, they're huge migrations. So if you think of herring as that migration and enabling that migration, also gardeners have a role in that too, believe it or not, with capturing as much as you can in your yard, purifying water, holding it, filtering it. It's just a huge, huge thing, and this is happening right in our backyard. And so, and the amount of time that it took, even just if you look at the numbers of herring, it was down to 20,000 fish coming up, and just in 2016, I think it was proposed, and in 2017, this fish dam went in just recently in Winchester Center, and now the fish have access all the way to Horn Pond. And so you are suddenly seeing this huge influx of fish to the point where the numbers are jumping each year. And so I just think that it's an incredible story, and also that these ecosystems can happen quickly. And if you have a yard that has a huge teeming microbial life, it's not just your yard that's affected. You have microbial taxi cabs in robins. They're pulling worms out of your yard, they're eating them, and they're getting soil microbes all over themselves and going to the next yard and making it that much easier for your neighbors and your community to start building up this capacity. And so it's hard to measure, it's hard to see happening, but if you make a difference in your own space, big things can happen, and it can happen really rapidly. So I really think that this next decade is it will be an incredible thing to see. And I think that each gardener has a potential for opening up a lot of those migrations coming through, and every time you get more migrations, you get more life. The more life you get, the more carbon you have captured in that life. You have all these things happening at once. And so I think that there's an incredible opportunity now, and I'm just looking forward to seeing what's happening. So in the next couple of years, so I'll just leave it with that. But thank you all so much for coming. And if anyone has any questions, love to answer questions. I'll just also one more thing to say that the Carbon Sequestering Garden is available as a PDF for free on the NOFA Mass website. There's also a handout in the back if you'd like. I didn't print as many handouts for people, but I think it's also going to be sent out. So if you'd like to have one, feel free to take one. The link is at the bottom there. Also, we do have some printed copies. They're $5 to just cover the printing costs. But if you'd like an actual copy of the booklet, but otherwise they're online for free. So let me just hand over the Carbon Sequestering Garden, which is a booklet that I helped with writing. So the question was, do you think that if healthy soil is created in the Midwest, it would be able to help capture water and mitigate flooding in the Midwest? I think that's absolutely possible. And there's some really incredible stories of farmers who are starting to transition to a biologically aware agriculture. So more and more and more, we're bringing biology into agriculture, and that is, again, a paradigm shift. So we've thought about soil from the chemical and physical properties, and that's been a way we've treated soil, even in the way we do fertilizers and pest management. We haven't thought about soil as having an immune system or a resistance or capacity. So a lot of the ways we've treated soil, we've actually, we've really done some intense things, and we've burned through our organic matter. So essentially, we are down to between 0 and 2% organic matter in the Midwest, where it used to be much, much higher. And so I completely think that you can capture a lot of out. There's already farmers who are doing it. They're spending less on inputs, and they are maintaining or maximizing outputs, higher quality, more nutrient-dense food. And so they are already shifting the conversation, just purely on an economic scale. And that's why I feel particularly hopeful about this, is because the economics are shifting. And there's a huge amount of industry that wants to maintain you buying as much inputs as possible. And so it's hard to push it, but I know that so many farmers are hitting a really difficult level that they're switching to what their neighbors are doing, they're succeeding. So that is shifting. And if you just look up, there's a book called From Mainstream to Mavericks, or Mavericks to Mainstream, and it's about no-till farming, and specifically reducing erosion rates in the US, but the amount of no-till that's kind of caught on is huge in the US, and it's growing. From Mavericks to Mainstream, and it's about no-till farming in the US. No-till also uses some chemical pesticides as well, but they're shifting to a more biologically aware system as well. So it's very inspiring because it also is including everybody. So the shift for soil being more biologically active and really looking at the biology, and we just haven't been aware of it in the same way.
Massachusetts has a healthy soils bill in the legislature.
Yes, so Massachusetts has a healthy soils bill in the legislature. And so that is also something that we're trying to do right here locally in Massachusetts, to provide funding for people who are doing regenerative practices. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely
Call your representatives.
call your representatives. And there's some great stuff about that also on the NOFA Mass website as well, if anyone wants to look into that further. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions.
Can you spell Norfolk?
NOFA Mass, it's a Northeast Organic Farming Association, the Massachusetts chapter. It's NOFA MASS. So it's NOFA.MASS.org is the website. So, and thank you for clarifying that. I really appreciate that. I sometimes use acronyms, and it's great to have questions. So the question was, how badly are invasive plants bothering our local ecosystems? So I will say, there's a lot of, I think there's a number of people who have different opinions on them. I will say that in terms of biomass, they are producing a lot of plant matter, so they are in some senses sequestering carbon. So things like Japanese knotweed and other things are creating that biomass. But one thing that I think is really tricky about invasives, and some people also say that there's a fine line between invasives, like what defines an invasive, and there's a lot of things there. And putting that aside, Doug Tallamy is a guy who wrote Bringing Nature Home and also The Living Landscape, and he has some really compelling arguments for specifically why native plants help foster our native ecosystem. And one thing I'll just mention is he talks about a lot of ornamental plants, and I think invasive plants have similar properties. But ornamental plants oftentimes don't host nearly the same amount of species here. So for example, chickadees need between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise a single brood of chickadees. And so if you don't have those caterpillars, they only feed caterpillars, no other insect, just caterpillars. It's the perfect baby food apparently. Oak trees host between, it's like 400 to 450 species of caterpillars. So oak trees are like way up there. Ginkgo trees, which are not native here, they're beautiful in many ways and lovely. They host, it's something like 2 species of caterpillars. So and that's just with an ornamental. The same is true for a lot of invasive species. And so he had a team of graduate students looking at biodiversity counts in invasive species areas and finding them to be equivalent of deserts. Like they don't have a lot of insect support, and that is key in a lot of our ecosystems. So I will just, there's a lot of factors at play, but also in terms of microbiology, we don't really know what they're doing to the soil. They do change the soil, so things like garlic mustard tend to dominate, and they do sort of change the soil as well. But I think also that if we don't replace them with something, so if you just take them down and you disturb the soils, so you bring them down to the base level, they are in some ways they oftentimes respond to disturbance. And so if we're not building back soil structure, then you can also call them low disturbance plants too. So it is also interesting just to think about what their role is. So just putting a lot of different pieces there, but it is interesting thinking about that and just trying to figure out the best way to combat that. If that answers your question. So mycorrhizal fungi, actually that's a very good point. So brassicas in general, so these are broccoli family, including cabbage, arugula, all these things don't have a relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, which is really fascinating, I think. They have a different relationship underground, but just not with mycorrhizal fungi. And they're actually still useful in cover crop plantings, which is really fascinating, I find. But you're right, they don't have a relationship. So with the fact that some plants have really natural defense systems, so some weeds that spread really aggressively, they tend to put out certain chemicals very gently. It's not like harsh chemicals or anything, but they do tend to dominate a landscape. So actually, this is another thing that's kind of interesting for native species, but squash plants also used to be able to, and some still do, have the capacity to suppress weeds around them. And there's been some really interesting research at the USDA, but starting to breed seeds in situ, seeing how well they do in a certain environment is really interesting. But I just think, when you think of the Three Sisters, part of the reason squash plants are down there is to actually suppress weeds, not just because they're big leaves, but also because they have very subtle chemical capacity in the soil. And so there's plants that have that capacity. It's a very interesting world, and some of that we can use to our advantage in, say, the garden, and kind of naturally have weed control. And also that can happen on a larger scale as well. So I think that's very, very interesting. One other thing I was going to mention about invasive species, there's also a really fascinating study looking at higher tick concentrations in areas that have invasive species, which is fascinating. And also, denser areas, there's a lot more animal growth. Who knows if it's more humid or what it is, but there's higher tick populations in areas. And I've also noticed, I don't know, I've been trying to notice in my own thing, this is only qualitative, or this is only the data that I've kind of, in my explorations, but I have noticed that open forest lands, you don't get the same level of tick pressure as you do when you're walking through a very dense area that is full of multiflora rose or bittersweet or all sorts of things like that. So I've noticed that for myself, but I thought that was a very fascinating study, but I don't know how many people have studied that, so it's just interesting. That's actually, so the question is it a good idea to put invasive plants in your compost heaps? I think the main thing is if you're able to break them down, so if either you have an incredibly active biology in your soil or a very hot compost, you can break things down. You can break down an enormous amount of stuff. There also are some really fascinating companies now that are doing, that are putting out, so advancing eco-agriculture is one of them, and it has some products that are really good at encouraging microbes to eat organic matter rapidly. So it's really good for crop residue. And so I think it would be really interesting to see if you have all that biomass on your land, if you're able to kind of fuel soil biology, it could be really interesting. Again, thinking about really aggressive invasive species is oftentimes existing in disturbed soils. So just think about that if there's ways that you can, again, kind of just have a sense for what they're doing in that landscape and why they're there. You can kind of have opportunities for bypassing it. So it might be worth the try. Be really careful with it. You don't want to spread them around. So if you are carefully monitoring things, I think it's worth a try. So I know people probably have very different opinions on that. So, but I think. In terms of invasive species, I was talking with a woman who had done a really fascinating strategy for getting rid of pretty
And I don't
aggressive
know if
vines.
it's all invasive.
Yeah, if it's very thick, there's probably a fair number of invasives in there. Probably, I mean maybe not, but the and I did know a woman who what she did is she would actually cut down some of the undergrowth, leaving some of the bigger trees. And shrubs or other things that she wanted to keep, identifying, I mean, if you're able to identify what they are, and it helps. And she was able to put compost, and then also, actually, I think for her specifically, she just put newspaper or cardboard, and then she put huge stacks of wood chips on top of them. You can also inoculate them with different mushroom species, and either harvest some mushrooms, but also that huge weight of wood chips, like 6 inches to a foot deep. And they actually, the soil, especially when they're in place, you can actually break them down, especially if they're hardwoods in particular. So like you can actually get a large number of things down, but it's like a kind of a, if you keep them stable, they can break down really rapidly, and you can actually, within a few years, get an actual beautiful soil. And again, if you're checking it and able to measure the depth of your topsoil increase, that can be really interesting. So there are a handful of people who do that. Some people I've seen in the city will sometimes take asphalt. There's an asphalt layer, and if they can't remove it, or it's concrete or something, they'll put layers of compost and wood chips on top of each other. And as long as you don't mix them up regularly, and you let that carbon source sit, and the microbes access it when they need to, and kind of build that network, you can actually build soil really rapidly that way. So there's a lot of different strategies for soil. And I also just will mention quickly that people, we oftentimes think about ourselves as kind of the disturbers of environments, and that is oftentimes true. But there is a lot of really interesting research looking at the role that humans have had in a lot of major ecosystems that we thought were kind of had existed sort of naturally. So for example, now there's a handful of articles that are out about how huge swaths of the Amazon rainforest may have been partially human planted and directed. Huge parts of Australia were actually, it's a massive sustainably farmed estate, if you will. But all sorts of these crazy factors. Also, a number of people, a number of different tribes, Native American tribes in California, they are actually finding that so they used to eat this one type of tuber in California that's now this little tiny flower, and they're endangered. There are hardly any of them left, and people are wondering, how is it possible that this tiny little tuber was a major food source? And what they're finding is that it sounds like that this tuber actually evolved to be eaten. So just like perennials in your garden, when you break them up and spread them around, every time you harvest them, you break them up, spread them around, and if you leave them clumped together, they eventually kind of dwindle and don't do that. So there's a number of plants in our landscape that actually benefit from being broken up. They also wonder if clam and mussel and oyster beds also benefited from being not harvested intensely, but harvested a little bit so that it breaks up and spreads around some of this biomass. So there's like a really interesting role, I think, of humans in the landscape, and being able to reclaim that role in a way that is not destructive, but I think also just really engaging with the landscape. So I just put that out there as well.
Bye.